Probando. Uno, dos, tres. ¿Me escuchas bien? Genial. Vale. ¿Cuánta carga tiene?
Según que están completas.
Sí, más o menos. Prueba eso. A ver. No, pero prueba acá.
Ah, ok. Es el 2.
¿Me escuchas? Uno, dos, tres. Uno, dos, tres. ¿Me escuchas?
Creo que está bien. Gracias.
places are all disappointing with the way maybe I'd go for something.
always that they deserve. So this was only possible because people like Alfonso, like Yvette, downstairs yesterday, Lucy and the computer department are working for us. And so the help that they are providing us is what makes everything possible. Also the academic secretariat here, Fernanda Samaniego, and obviously the chair, Ms. Estrada, have made this very easy for us and have made it very comfortable, I guess, for everybody. So we want to thank them and to say that this wouldn't be possible without their help. Now, this is Otavio Bueno, and Otavio is going to be the chair of today's session. So, Otavio.
Thank you. No.
I think you want to see as well.
Okay. All right. So, well, welcome all to our first session this morning. It's a great pleasure to introduce Bruno Malavolta Silva. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow here at UNAM. He has a PhD in philosophy from the Federal University of Porto Alegre, in Rio Grande do Sul, in Porto Alegre, in Brazil. Most of his work is in philosophy of science, especially on scientific realism. He used to be a very hardcore scientific realist. Now he's a little less, but is still hanging in there, doing work. He has written about underdetermination problems, incommensurability, new inductive defenses of scientific realism. And today, in the more recent work, he's been focusing on embodied cognition and how that affects ways of thinking about perspectival realism. In that sense, he's a little less realist. Today, he's going to tell us about anti-intellectualism and scientific understanding. The floor is yours.
Now you should press the button that you have.
So good morning to everyone. Today I want to explore a little bit how the notion of understanding connects with embodied understanding and cognition. And I will try to do it from the angle of anti-intellectualism. So these are a lot of new things for me today, but I will try to focus on the main question of if there is understanding without explanatory knowledge or explanatory understanding. And I will try to motivate the claim that yes, we can have tacit forms of understanding. And more to the end, I will try to at least sketch an answer for a question of opacity, which is, well, if we have some performative abilities and they are tacit, so we are not able to ground explanations based on those abilities, why can't we do so? So nowadays, there are some folks who use the expression, the phrase anti-intellectualism, in a general sense to say that basic forms of cognition, primarily perception, can happen without higher forms of cognition, such as reasoning. But the expression comes from Gilbert Ryle, so he would defend what I would consider nowadays one variety of anti-intellectualism, but his main thesis is that know-how cannot be reduced to know that. And this motivates what are called radical anti-intellectualists nowadays, which would be the people who try to go a step further and claim that know that can be reduced to know-how. So Jake talked a little bit about that previously, but Harrington is a main author who tried to defend this sort of idea. And if we are to reduce all knowledge to know-how, then we need some account of what is know-how. I will rely on the virtue-theoretic approach. So here, knowing how to phi will be a cognitive achievement due to an ability or skill to intentionally perform phi. This is an account from Carter and Pritchard. So in Ryle's work, he tried to defend that we could equivalate the notions of know-how, ability, and skill and understand them all in terms of dispositions. I think that this cannot be held anymore, and the reason is that we can think of many cases where we have abilities but we don't have know-how. So Stephen gave an example when he said that my kidney has the ability to produce insulin, but I could also say that, well, if I have low blood pressure, I have the ability to pass out when I don't eat, but I may not know how to pass out because I may not know the means to do it if I don't know my condition. So cases like that show us that know-how requires some sort of cognitive control and agency, but still they would be a cognitive achievement, which in paradigmatic cases will be the performance of an action. And if we want to try to reduce know that to this formula, we would have to say that the achievement is a true belief, which can be based on any sort of justificatory abilities. If we are anti-factualist about understanding, we might also try to find some home in this formula by considering that the acceptance of some clients might be a sort of cognitive achievement. So accepting an empirically adequate model or theory might be a cognitive achievement in some sense as well. But I will rely and work within this framework, but I cannot defend it all just today, because I would have to approach all the forms of understanding, and there's only limited time. So my focus will be specifically on anti-intellectualism about understanding and the idea that we cannot reduce understanding just to explanatory knowledge, because we have tacit forms of understanding. Now, to make this approach minimally plausible, we have to show how skill-based achievements can be knowledge, and this requires facing an initial objection, which arises from environmental luck. So folks like McDowell, who will try to defend that perception is a capacity based on reasoning as well, they will argue that skill-based achievements are compatible with luck, while knowledge requires safety. And because of that, we cannot equivalate knowledge with skill-based achievements. And we can illustrate that with a very famous case with Mary, who is participating in a psychological experiment. And so Mary has to identify the color of objects, but we have some scientists who in half of the time randomly will manipulate the light to make what is actually a white ball look like a red ball because of the light. So the point is that Mary is exercising her perceptual abilities. He can even form a true belief, but still he wouldn't have knowledge because it might be lucky for him that the scientists are not manipulating the light. And what anti-intellectualists say in response to cases like that is that we have to comprehend abilities as having an ecological component. So what makes an ability to be possessed is being competent at performing phi in the relevant environments. So in that case, we can think of a simpler example when we think that I can have the ability to shoot, being an archer, without having the ability to shoot in a storm. So it's perfectly possible to possess the former ability without the later. And analogously, Mary can possess the ability to discriminate colors in ordinary environments, but when we enter this sort of environment, they end up making his ability impossible to be exercised. And so we don't have a genuine case of a skill-based achievement in these environments. Now, the idea of tacit knowledge is very widespread, and a paradigmatic example of it is facial recognition. So if I were to ask anyone to explain the difference between the face of Van Diesel and The Rock, it might be nearly impossible. We certainly cannot transmit the ability to recognize the difference for someone who has never saw their faces, but still we can easily distinguish them. And so this is a case of tacit knowledge, but the question that interests us is, well, is that understanding? So here I think that many people would say that no. People like Zagzebski or Pritchard who actually claim that to understand something, you have to understand that you understand. And that is an over-intellectualized requirement, I would say. There are also some people like Karim Khalifa who don't make so rigorous requirement, but would still say that to understand something, you must be able to explain. And because we don't have explanatory abilities in this case, I'm not sure, but I think he would say that no. So I think that to make this connection between this kind of tacit know-how and understanding, the best way to do it would be to rely on Byhan's account of model understanding, which presents model understanding of a phenomenon, pi, by knowing how to navigate some space of possibilities associated with that phenomenon. So by relying on this notion of model understanding, I am suggesting that we should not comprehend model understanding as some very extraordinary form of understanding that only the best scientists achieve. Instead, we should take model understanding to express our basic abilities to navigate the world. And so we should realize that we learn to perceive the world by exploring it, showing how the world can behave, and eventually knowing to anticipate the behavior of things and knowing how they must behave on certain occasions. So if perception is this sort of dynamical process, we get that all perception has a model content. And if that is so, knowledge of modality should be more ordinary. And then on this notion of Byhan, now trying to unpack it a little more, we have this idea of a possibility space for the phenomenon, and that would be the set of dependency structures in those possible worlds that give rise to any instance of that phenomenon. So the possibility space includes any scenario in which the phenomenon might happen. And knowing how to navigate this possibility space is unpacked by Byhan in 3 levels. The first level would be knowing how a particular dependency structure gives rise to some instance of the phenomenon. So I must learn how this phenomenon might emerge in some circumstance. And Byhan tells us that this knowing how might be the manifestation of many sorts of skills, like inferential skills, model building skills, question answering skills. And here I am suggesting that we could also insert perceptual skills in here to account for these tacit forms of know-how and thereby understanding. The next 2 levels of model understanding would be knowing how various dependency structures are related and also knowing how this space may have some general constraints to all structures in it. And I think that at least until the second point, we might have tacit understanding. To illustrate so, I will rely on the work of Peter Lipton, who I think that is the seminal defense of that. And Lipton argues for it. He tries to dissociate the notion of understanding from an explanation, and he does so by telling us that, well, we can look at some cognitive benefits that we achieve through explanations and that seem to be intimately related with understanding. So he gives us 4 benefits: causal information, unification, a sense of necessity of what must happen counterfactually, and a sense of possibility as well. I will focus on the first 2 by time reasons. But then the point that he makes is that such benefits might be achieved without explanation as well. So when we achieve in that way, we end up having something that looks a lot like understanding, that smells like understanding, and so maybe can be thought of in terms of understanding. When he tries to defend in the case of causal information, then he tells us that, well, we might acquire causal information in many tacit ways, such as observation, experimentation, manipulation, and inferences. And in those cases, we might find that there is such thing as tacit understanding, but not tacit explanation, because explanation requires propositions who are explicit about what we are talking about. And one example of how we can acquire causal information tacitly is given by honorary, which would be a mechanism for how the planets orbit around the sun, or simply by presenting a visual presentation, a visual image of retrograde motion to explain that. So he tells us that he cannot understand retrograde motion until he sees an image like that, because in an image like that, you can easily see that the apparent retrograde motion of the planet emerges because of the difference of angle from the Earth to that planet. And I can show that. I can also, if I try to explain without the image, try to simulate the movements of the planets with my hands and do some sort of embodied explanation. But it would be very hard to convey all this visual information just with verbal acts. So I couldn't really be capable of explaining this, or maybe at least there are some scenarios in which I can understand this and not be able to explain it. He also makes the point for tacit unification, and that he makes with Kuhnian exemplars, which are very well known. So exemplars set up similarity relations among different phenomena and different approaches on how to deal and solve those phenomena. So if I take a case like the representation of the orbits of planets, which were an exemplar in Newtonian mechanics, that would suggest new puzzles because it suggests that I could try to represent the orbit of other planets in the same way. And if a planet has an anomalous orbit, then I have a new puzzle. And at the same time, I have a standard on what I expect for a solution of those problems. And the important point, again, is that in those cases, this sort of guidance offered by the exemplars is tacit. So Kuhn demonstrates for us that we don't have an algorithm of rules that we could follow on how to do science, on how to know what to inquire, and how to solve these problems. But still, we can find some similarities, relations, and guidance in these exemplars. And they also offer some sort of unification by showing how different phenomena or different problems can be gathered together in the same sort of technique to be solved. Now, I think that Lipton's arguments could be further developed if we looked for some framework within embodied cognition. And there are some conservative approaches to embodied cognition which would still maintain the notion of representation. But for our point, it would be better to invoke the idea of radical embodied cognition, which would say that representation is not needed to explain all forms of cognition, such as perception. So this is an epistemological thesis. We are not claiming that mental representations don't exist, and so we might have propositional knowledge with mental representations as well. But there is a dimension of cognition that is not associated to representations. And there are many approaches to radical embodied cognition, such as ecological psychology, material engagement theory. I will rely on one specifically, which is radical enactivism. And it would tell us that there is cognition without content, without propositional or representational content. So when we think of organisms like bacteria or cells, we can think that they have many abilities to distinguish things in their environment, and they also can adapt their behavior to react to the same sort of situations in different ways. So a bacteria might react to the presence of some nutrient by approaching it, but if it is satisfied, then it does methylation and desensibilizes itself to not look for ingredients when it doesn't need to. In this way, it achieves more proficient way for its survival. And, well, this suggests that there is some type of cognition, but still it would be nonsense to attribute beliefs or propositional content to a bacteria or a cell. So there is a sort of cognition that is not based on representational content here. And maybe that makes us rethink human cognition as well. So this notion of cognition without content might be a little mysterious, because if we are not having content, what are we recognizing? For that, the enactivist will replace the notion of content with the notion of sensory-motor engagement and tell us that, well, we are learning how to engage with our environment and how to learn what we can do in that environment. And the key point here is that although sensory-motor engagement doesn't have content, it does allow us to pick up information about that environment. So we have many kinds of cellular memory in which a cell might learn how to adapt and react in different ways to a sort of situation. For example, this bacteria might register some viral DNA once it is attacked by it to avoid that same virus DNA or process it in different ways when it's contaminated again. So we might have ways of registering information inside the cell and learn to engage in different ways with the environment, even without representations. And that makes us easy to understand the idea of tacit knowledge, because now we could make the case that, well, these sensory motor abilities provide some cognition because they pick up information even without content. And if we rely on the framework of virtual epistemology, then these cognitive achievements are sufficient for making knowledge, for making perceptual knowledge. So there is a kind of know-how without content, which is tacit know-how. How do we connect with understanding, though? For that, I think that we can get a better grasp by relying on model artifactualism. And artifactualists will tell us that we should think of models in terms of tools or instruments that enable us to perform new forms of actions. So models will scaffold certain activities which allow us to engage with the world or with a phenomena in novel ways. And in this way, they expand our cognitions. This is easier to think of when we think about physical models like model organisms or an hydraulic machine that represents an economical system. And in these cases, I can do certain experiments with the model organisms, see how poison and toxin is on it, make condition experiments and so on, and nothing of that would be possible without the model organism. Of course, there is a long way to go until I can make inferences from the rats and to humans, but by interacting with them all, I might engage with the phenomenon in other ways. Now, this has a seminal defense in Morgan and Morrison work, and for them, these model tools will have an autonomous dimension because they are partly built on basis of data and partly built on the basis of our theories. So they end up not reducing to any one of them, and then they become autonomous agents. But afterwards, artifactualists make the point that, well, what you can do with a tool depends on its materiality, and its internal properties, its shape, and so on. And so when we try to explain the sorts of engagements that these models allow us to do, these sort of accounts must consider the physical properties of the models. So in case of graphics, it's easy to see that what a graphic shows us depends on its visual features. But generally, the idea is that in order to assess the epistemic powers of a model, I shouldn't look at its internal features solely abstracted from the practice. So I shouldn't look at the model as a fixed representation. Instead, I should try to look on what scientists do with the model. So even when we look at an abstract model like an equation, what makes us learn the most with that equation is learning how to manipulate it, showing what are the relationships between the equation and different parts of the theory, learning to see what laws follow from what, and also how we can apply these equations to different sorts of phenomena. So this gives us a basis to claim that, well, if one learns how to engage with the models of a phenomenon, then one might improve our ability to navigate the possibility space for that phenomenon. Assuming by Hans Cons, therefore, one will be improving the understanding of the phenomenon by improving its ability to navigate the possibility space. So insofar as because these forms of knowing how to engage with the models can be tacit knowledge, we also might have some tacit form of understanding which we increase our ability to navigate phenomenon by acquiring these forms of engagement. So the final question would be, well, if we have these forms of tacit understanding, why can't we use them to ground some explanatory abilities? I don't have a complete answer here, but I want to suggest a sketch. And that relies a little bit on the invariance account of laws, which will tell us that scientific generalizations represent a structure that is invariant to a range of circumstances, but also shielded from external interference. So they are not exceptionless. When you think about the law of supply, Mendel's law, it is easy to see that those laws might suffer external interference for many sorts of factors. There are philosophers like Nancy Cartwright who tell us that even the fundamental laws of physics, as far as you know them, require some ceteris paribus clausulus to be shielded from interferences. And within these invariance accounts, there might be some disagreeing on what we should call as a law. So some authors like Lange will say that we should reserve the expression of natural laws only to the things that are counterfactually necessary in all sorts of cases. Authors like Woodward would claim that, well, there are degrees to how much a generalization is invariant, and so we must establish some thresholds between scientific laws, causal generalizations, and accidental generalizations, which don't resist to any sort of counterfactual intervention. And other authors like Mitchell will put scientific laws on a less rigorous standard to say that, well, you can consider any sort of these things as laws because what matters is if they help us to predict and explain things for science. Either way, the point is that on one hand, when we talk about knowing how and tacit understanding, we can see that those are based on our performative abilities, and those performative abilities are indexed to certain environments. So to have the ability to be a shooter, I might not be in storms and so on, and I might overestimate or doubt my abilities and think that I can shoot in a storm and be wrong, but that would not cancel my ability of being a competent archer. This creates an asymmetry when we look to explanatory knowledge, because when we try to perform some explanation, we will invoke some knowledge that some proposition Q explains P. And then, because we have explicit propositions, we must introduce the parameters that specify how far is our invariance extended. And so we must face a particular epistemological problem of external validity. How can I know that the invariance within my experimental setups can be inferred to other sorts of setups? And so I must have some positioning about that in order for my sentences to have a propositional content. Otherwise, I am not able to make propositions and knowledge. So as I said, it's a very general point. It's just a sketch of an answer. But I think that it might make at least a little bit less mysterious the idea of tacit understanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno. So we have time for questions. If you raise your hand, start with Steve.
Bruno, that was great. Thank you. So just to make sure I understand, so you're willing to grant bacteria understanding because they can navigate possibility space? I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm just figuring out what you think.
Yeah. These gray line cases, I think they end up depending a lot more on the idea of agency and cognitive control, which I said at the beginning. So we must record that the notion of know-how requires not only abilities, but also cognitive agency.
Okay.
So the key question would be, can you attribute agency to a bacteria? And there, I'm not sure. There, those approaches of an activists invoke the idea of autopoiesis.
Okay.
Then it gets controversial. They invoke more elaborate terms of adaptation, which should be associated to autopoiesis to say that, well, we must also be able to adapt our habits and the rules that guide our behavior. in some sense in order to have agency.
Okay.
So they have alternative conceptions of agency that try to be less over-intellectualized, and I cannot tell what this make about bacteria.
Okay.
So
So I was, again, I'm not, I mean, say bacteria have an understanding of their possibilities, but then if you're willing to take that step, I was wondering, so why wouldn't you what would prevent the theory from saying something like that rocks like are able to navigate a possibility space? Like there's some, if I release a rock, there's some sense in which it might travel upward or downward, but there's a model where you might say that the rock follows like the model of gravity or physics or whatever it is, such that it would determine that the rock, among these possibilities, that the rock goes down. And then that might be a bridge too far to say that the rock has understood. Bacteria may be a borderline case, but the rock. But if you say that agency is required, then the rock would count.
yeah,
But
yeah.
then I guess you need to give an account of agency that's
Yes, it is an open problem for me. Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have lots of thoughts about these sorts of things. You can tell from my talk. But so I'm just going to ask like maybe 2 questions. So like the classic case of like tacit knowledge or tacit understanding, like the most well understood sort of case is like tacit linguistic knowledge or tacit linguistic understanding. But the fact that some bit of knowledge or understanding is tacit does not mean it's non-representation, right? So for example, like when you look at cases of tacit linguistic knowledge, when a child acquires language, for example, I mean, the language in which we describe what the child acquires, now, knowledge of noun phrases, quantificational verbs, things like that, is thoroughly representational, right? That doesn't mean the child can introspect and figure out that what they're acquiring is, when exposed to language, is representational in character, or that they're acquiring noun phrases or anything. But that doesn't mean it's not representational, you see. So then it seems like just showing that there are cases of tacit understanding doesn't mean that they're not representational. Now, that might be a nice middle ground view just in the following sense, because it's not over-intellectualized in this way, that Ryle is worried about, where Ryle is worried about having to like currently contemplate a proposition or something, which is what embodied people are often quite worried about, right? And none of that actually seems to happen when we do stuff. So that's just like the first thing. So I just want to like hear more about this equivalence, this seeming equivalence that's being drawn. And then the second thing I'm worried about is that, so how can disposition, actually I'm going to ask this other question instead. So also I'm pretty fine with there being tacit understanding in kind of various forms, one of which might be linguistic and one of which might be this other sort of sense or something. Because I think understanding is just, the word is just thoroughly polysemous, right? As we've all talked about, there's so many notions of understanding, like which one matters, right, is an important question. But once we recognize the polysemy of understanding, just showing that there is a sense of tacit understanding that exists, that can be applied even maybe to bacteria. I mean, it doesn't show that this is about scientific understanding, right? So it's like, to me, it's like any notion, it seems, of scientific understanding, if we're really trying to identify scientific understanding, has to do with what humans are doing and what humans can uniquely do, given that we are the only ones that actually do science, And then so, extending this understanding concept from bacteria all the way to humans, even if you're able to do it, the question might be, you're covering up as much as you're revealing by doing it, because this is a distinctively human activity, the one we're engaging in, it seems like. So I guess I just want to get your thoughts about that.
The first point, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Have the clarity about that, so thank you, first of all.
Yeah.
But the idea is that we can have propositional linguistic tacit knowledge as well.
Right, yeah. It's just that in items of understanding or tacit, an item of understanding being tacit does not mean it's not representational.
Yes.
Right,
yes.
yeah. And so then, you know, you could take two paths with this, right? You could say actually that all this, you know, that even bacteria represent just tacitly, right? Because they can't like introspect on their representations, right? And some people think that if they think representation is cheap. But then you sort of have, these are like kind of like almost notationally equivalent views in various ways, except one is just sensorimotor engagement and the other is representation. So then you need something to like break the tie. But that's just the sort of claim I'm advancing here. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I need to be more, to make more minor distinctions about what is inside tacit understanding.
Yeah.
I can see that. For the second point, I mean, of course, scientific understanding is way more sophisticated than bacteria cognition, but the point is to open a path in which we can approach them in terms of the abilities and instead of over-relying on the notion of representation. So these artifactualists would eventually make the point that model-based cognition can give us access to inferences only through these sorts of engagements. And when we learn to make inferences based on models and on intervening with a phenomenon and seeing their analogies, and so we learn to use a model by interacting with both the phenomenon and the model, the sort of knowledge that we achieve in that places relies, if it relies on the notion of representation, it is only in a notion that is extremely deflated to the point where it becomes equivalent to an inferential practice. And so the notion of representation becomes dispensable to explain our practice in there. That is at least the proposal of.
So how do you explain these abilities, which are dispositional properties that have no categorical basis? What's the categorical basis that explains the abilities? Like you might think like the representation is what explains the ability, right? Like the having of the thing that has the content that lets you then do things with those functions or something. Now, inference is actually a bad example because inference will not be explicit. Inferential properties will not be explicitly represented on a representationalist view, right? Because of Lewis Carroll type problems. But you know, it's not implausible to think that things like abilities are grounded in certain things and representations play exactly that role, no? Or
Yeah, but we can also perceive the dispositions of things and then know it and eventually make inferences about it. And I don't see why we would need the notion of representation for that.
okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you. I was just, I would like to have more clarity about the connection between the artifactual approach to models and your anti-intellectualism. And I think there's a distinction that has to be made before you connect the two things between models that are just abstract entities and material models, because both things have been analyzed under the name artifactual models. So you can have a very abstract model of whatever and still argue that the representational nature of that model is still purely as a tool, as an intellectual tool. And in that case, I don't see how you could avoid asking for propositional knowledge all the way down. So you seem to be focusing on material models. But even then, I think propositional knowledge is required even to, if you take the extreme example of, let's say, of a live mouse as a live model, you need to know that that's the right organism. You need to know lots of things about the behavior of the mouse. You need to know how the mouse normally behaves with other mice. I don't know, lots of things, and even, so I'm having trouble understanding where the propositional knowledge fades out.
Where the propositional knowledge fades out. Well, it's certainly entrenched with all these practices. It's certainly helping us to make more refined inferences all the way. But the point is that perceptual abilities can derive forms of knowledge simply by exploring the environment and by learning what we can do with the environment, because we create new perceptual habits to disambiguate ambiguous situations and so on. And when we reflect about that, we might formulate propositions to tell people about what we are doing. So, of course, in scientific practice, they are dynamically interacting in both levels. So it might be extremely shady on where the propositional knowledge fades away. But the point is that the propositional knowledge is not doing all the normative work. There is a dimension of normativity that comes from perception and know-how by itself.
You mean we're talking about the interaction between the scientist and the live model, for example, or how's that? I'm having trouble understanding exactly what kinds of interactions are the ones that become tacit. Tacit knowledge.
Yes, yes. If the distinction between non-propositional propositional knowledge is shady because they are constantly interacting, I think that we would have to accept that the distinction between tacit and non-tacit knowledge also might have degrees. So we might gradually learn to explain what we are doing. And that might invoke not only material models, but also abstract models when we think that abstract models can be conceived as structures that are not propositioned with a truth value. So philosophers like Nancy Cartwright would tell us that many scientific laws by themselves don't have a truth value, because the important thing about these models is what we can do with them, what comparisons we can do with those models in reality, and then we may idealize the model, we may make some specific comparisons that don't regard the idealized aspects of the model, and we might apply a law in many different ways. And so what ends up having a propositional content and a truth value is how we apply those structures to make comparisons with reality, not the structures by themselves. So the structures can be thought of in terms of a mental tool that helps us to extract analogies and to do some sorts of action that are useful for scientific inquiry. That's the general idea, I think.
But I don't see how truth is important here. In the case of the abstract models, how can you possibly idealize or do any of those things without propositional, using propositions? I mean, at the very end, maybe you can apply it in some more automatic way once you have everything built up, but most of the activity is going to be entirely propositional. But anyway, I'll let somebody else.
No, but yeah, I'm perfectly willing to concede that most of the abilities might be propositional in those cases of highly sophisticated scientific knowledge. My point is that just that they are not reduced to it.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. That was really great. My question was kind of asked. I'm going to rehearse it, but I'm not asking you to answer again. So instead, if that's okay, I'm going to give you a comment on how to address maybe some of the concerns that Jake and Andres have. And I want to see whether that route of, whether you would be amenable to that kind of route to address those concerns. So my question, for the record, was also that I wanted to have more a clear specification on how the tacit, the embodied, and the non-propositional aspect of what you're interested in relate to one another. So, but you already answered that question. So if I understand, so I'm going to the comment now. So if I understand correctly what you're trying to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are trying to define this notion of tacit understanding, which is based on performative abilities and not based on propositional knowledge, especially not explanatory knowledge. And you want to claim that there is a form of model-based cognition, a model-based practice in the sciences that relies on that kind of understanding, tacit understanding, embodied understanding. And that explains some of the concerns we have with some practices that don't seem to be really based on propositional knowledge, on theoretical investigations, but rather on doing stuff. Is that correct? Is that what you're trying to do, roughly?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand what's going on. So I think when there are concerns voiced like Jake's and Andres, one way, so here's a proposal, and tell me, I'm curious about whether you think it's the right way to go. It seems to me that the questions that are asked when you say, well, but it says propositional knowledge all the way down, or it is grounded in propositional knowledge anyway. It's kind of a chicken and an egg question, right? And so, just like, is it structure or entities that exist first? I was just thinking, like, we could have a Bueno article, right, about this, with the same, with a similar title. It's like, well, it's not, it's up in the air, right? So you tell me that the doing is based on the propositional knowledge. Well, I'm telling you, maybe the doing is what grounds the propositional knowledge. And who is to say that one is the other? I mean, it's at least an open question. There are, I mean, you could use his or Cheng's view of science, saying that actually it's more about doing than representing, and the representing stuff has been focused on, and the doing is more important. You could look at Oscar Westerblad as well, who is also focusing on the practical knowledge. And you might be able to avoid some of the concerns in the room if you take examples of scientific practice instead of, I love bacteria and animal cognition. That's actually it's a big interest of mine, all the non-human animal cognition, but you might have, fewer enemies or fewer. I'm always about having fewer enemies.
It's an easier road to hoe if you choose something other than bacteria.
Pick your battles. So it might be interesting to look into the examples we have of practical, of practices that are highly practical and embodied. I'll give an example tonight that also is looked at by Oscar. Nancy Nersessian also has a lot of stuff on how to build models, and she has a cognitive science stuff in there, and it could be cool examples there. Plus, she does all the work, so it's really cool. You can work to use a lot of her work. So it's like building models, creating models. I forget what the title of the book is, but there's this very cool book about how there is that practice, that's really engaged practice. You could look into biological engineers. I have lots of biological engineers that come to me and say, we're not having representations, theories, models, whatever. We just look at what this thing does, and we do the next move to make it do what we want it to do. And so those could be like strictly scientific examples that could be used to say, look, this exists. It's out there in the world, and it's, again, in those cases, it's not clear that the view that it's representations first and doing second is the most appropriate or adequate account of those practices. Does that make sense to you, or am I totally off?
No, of course, thank you very much. But maybe I should just stress that I'm not trying to deny propositional knowledge at any rate. It's more like offering a complement to it by showing that it has another dimension on which it interacts and acts as a source of normativity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that's a great strategy. You don't want to deny competition. That's way too many enemies.
Yeah.
That's just a problem of war. Thanks again for the talk.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask about the principle you mentioned that you understand something only if you can explain it. An explanatory knowledge, explanatory ability requirement on understanding. So if I understood the dialectic right, that's a kind of intellectualist principle, the way we're supposed to be thinking about things. And then one of the ideas that we've been talking about here that you appeal to the talk is that there are these cases where you have a kind of tool, an image or a model as a tool grounds understanding, but it doesn't ground explanatory ability. That was at least an idea that we're talking about, I think, and that would make trouble for the principle that you can understand something only if you can explain it. Maybe I misunderstood the dialectic a little bit there. That's a dialectic anyway. I sort of wanted to raise the possibility there's two quite different kinds of case here. So like one kind of case is that I've got this understanding which is tool grounded in some kind of external thing. And so I can't explain the thing without the tool ready to hand. But if the tool is present, then I can explain it. So that's like the orrery case, if I understand it, is that without the orrery, I can't really say much about the phenomenon in question. But I think if I have it present, then I can like turn it on and I can point to various parts of it and say, look at this, and show you how it works too. That's one kind of case, whereas I think like the bacterium, I'm not sure if it has a tool, but it can't even, it's not like there's like some tool it needs to explain stuff to me. It can't explain anything to me, or maybe the other, I don't know how bacteria, maybe they communicate with each other. I was thinking they don't communicate with each other, they don't explain anything. So, one possibility here is that instead of thinking that the need we have for tools and models and images, rather than thinking that shows that we can understand things without being able to explain them, what it shows is that we need to broaden our conception of an explanation. Or maybe not even, broaden it. Maybe it's not even broadening it. Like, you sort of identify someone who would put forward or appeal to a narrow conception of explanation. Because it sort of seems like often explaining things involves the environmental conditions being right and having access to the right stuff. Could I explain sort of how an automobile engine works without there being an automobile engine in front of me? Explain how to make a soup without the ingredients. So I wonder if the explanatory ability requirement that we were talking about is in better shape than, I guess in better shape than I thought you were implying it was in, because the fact that I need this tool, that I can't really say much without the tool present, doesn't indicate that I lack explanatory ability. It just indicates that the relevant ability is going to be manifested only when the conditions are right. Another aspect of that I would add is like, I think our explanatory abilities are probably only manifested when the conditions are right with respect to the audience sort of cooperating. I can sort of imagine, I think, someone who's got quite a lot of ability to explain things if they're asked the right questions or if they're approached in the right way. So it might be that certain kinds of explanatory abilities are not going to be manifested unless the hearer, the receiver of the explanation is doing their bit as well. So just wondering, there may be various ways in which the conditions have to be right, and that one of the ways in which the conditions have to be right for explanatory ability to be manifested is that some tool has to be present, you know, the orrery or the diagram. Yeah.
So, when I talk about the impossibility of explain, I think I am encountering what would be an intellectualist conception of explanation. By that I mean that a conception of explanation that is based on the manipulation of mental representations, which is the cognitivist approach. And so I think that we can find something like that in Khalifa, because he would talk about our explanatory knowledge by the belief that he explains P. And so we have propositions as the elements of explanations and manipulating these propositions. Even in the cases of proto-understanding that he makes, it is still about propositions. And so when we introduce material elements of the scene, it's a little bit hard to see how it is compatible at least if these propositions are general. But yeah, you could make the point that, well, then let me make a more sophisticated notion of explanation that accepts contextual elements and acts of showing and indexicals as part of the explanations. I could be sympathetic to that and say that, yeah, okay, that already makes the point that explaining it's not just about manipulating mental representations. It is also about interacting with the environment. But I would still have at least an intuition that we should make a distinction between explaining and showing, because these are mostly cases in which we exhaust our abilities to explain something and then we begin to show. So in science education, I think it's very common that when a teacher tries to explain the problem, let me show you, and then he solves the problem in front of the student instead of just doing a verbal explanation. And I think that this is more like an act of teaching by showing than teaching by explaining.
Two quick thoughts. One is that it would be really interesting to replace the explanatory ability requirement with a showing ability requirement, or something along those lines, right? So and I think the explanatory ability requirement goes back to the Socratic premise, right? If you really know it, you can teach it, right? So maybe the mistake has been focusing too much on explanation in this narrow verbal sense, and not on teaching or showing or sharing more broadly. Then you can rule out the bacterium, but rule in the scientist who needs a model. The other thing that direction to go here potentially is to think about what notion of the proposition is playing a role in what you just said, right? So I find that to be a very unfamiliar notion of a proposition to me, that a proposition is something purely verbal. I'm not even sure what the purely verbal or purely linguistic would be, but so like, imagine I saw the killer carried an umbrella and they say, what kind of umbrella? I say it was just like this one. That's a proposition that I asserted, but I couldn't have described this umbrella in any kind of detail without having it present. I wouldn't have gotten the same proposition anyway that I got by pointing at the umbrella. So I think that's a proposition. So there's just different notions of the proposition in philosophy, obviously, but maybe the way to go here is less about broadening the notion of explanation, but scrutinizing the notion of the proposition that's at play in the idea that, you know, once I incorporate a prop, or once I start going out of the blackboard, I'm beyond the propositional. That doesn't seem true to me at all. But that's just maybe because I have a different conception of the proposition.
No, I agree with that. I think I just would make the point that, well, when we have explanations of phenomena, we should consider that phenomena are not just an actual event, but they are a kind of event. So when I say, for example, that combustion is a real phenomena, that doesn't depend on happening combustion right now. It just depends on when the circumstances emerging, the phenomenon of combustion happens. So what determines the reality of a phenomenon is some sort of counterfactual invariants and structures. And this implies that in order to explain a phenomenon, I cannot appeal just to singular facts. I also must invoke some sort of structural dependency that has a general correlation with that phenomenon. So the notion of explanation must assume some general proposition, and not just propositions, I think. In those cases of explaining phenomena. I mean, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruno. This was great. I don't have so much of a comment as a suggestion. If you want to defend this notion of tacit understanding, one potentially good source to look at is Dewey's Democracy in Education, because even though Dewey was not primarily a philosopher of science, he was a great experimentalist throughout his entire life. And one of the points that he makes in Democracy in Education is that, he doesn't talk about models, but about experiments. And the point that he makes is that people, particularly young kids, learn by devising and performing experiments. And one of the things that he emphasizes and he has a very, very broad conception of experimentation. So for him, it's not just about mixing stuff in basically within a lab, but it's a very broad conception of experimentation that involves, for instance, learning how to pull a rope in a tug-of-war game, which is something that little kids basically do. And one of the things that he emphasizes in one of the early chapters of Democracy and Education is that by performing basically experiments as to how to basically learn how to best pull a rope, which is basically as you can tie basically to your conception of sensory motor engagement, because this is exactly what Dewey is talking about. He says that kids basically develop an understanding of how the world around them basically functions and how they can basically operate to succeed in achieving what they want.
Sorry, what was the name of the author?
John Dewey, Democracy and Education.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, there is a comment from the chat by Ana Rosa, and she says, would you say that every factual learning process is based on tacit understanding, and therefore this precedes propositional knowledge?
No, I wouldn't. Of course, if you take knowledge as testimonial knowledge, for example, it is this transmission of linguistic representation, so it couldn't just be tacit. Unless, of course, we return to the idea of tacit linguistic knowledge, but it's representational that I concede.
All right. Well, on this note, I think, unless you want me to arbitrarily choose someone who may not have a question to ask a question, we're going to thank our speaker. Thank you so much.